Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, conducted again via Skype, Cassia and I spoke with Ben Judah, the author of Fragile Empire and also This Is London.
We talked about how he got into writing and his early career as a foreign writer for magazines including Standpoint, and then went on to discuss his books in greater detail and had a very brief conversation about some of the ethics involved in writing This Is London.
Yeah, a short and snappy answer he gave to that one. Anyway, it was a really fascinating and wide-ranging conversation, and we hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello?
Hi, Ben.
Sorry about that.
Can you hear me? No, it's fine. Just don't worry. Technology can be...
We'd failed to put in a special code, which meant that it started literally playing white noise over the top of us on the recording.
Yeah.
Okay, let's gather ourselves and have a few seconds silence, and then we'll start. Okay. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. Cassia and I are here, or rather not actually physically here, but in Skype connection with Ben Judah, the author of Fragile Empire and also This Is London. Ben, it's great to have you here with us.
Thank you so much. It's really, really cool that you're so interested in my work. I feel really flattered.
Well, it's great to have you here. Could you start a bit by telling us about your beginnings as a writer, where you came from and where your sort of interest in writing and the areas that you've written about began?
My beginnings as a writer... I guess my beginnings as a writer would be on this sort of tiny little computer I had in about 2004, which I used to pretend to do my homework on. And I used to write these little stubs and short stories, or often paragraphs, which I would lie to my friends and claim were novels, which were pretty much universally sordid, violent, sexually explicit, and sort of fantasias about my school, London, and the sort of London underworld, and sort of like gothic, twisted tales of the Jewish community.
Sure.
Which is the second answer of like, where do you come from? I think, I was brought up bilingual in English and French, and lived for my childhood in the Balkans because my father's a journalist. Was educated in French lycées in the Balkans and then in London, and I've got British and French nationality. But the answer of where do you come from would be from the Jewish community.
Sure. And to what extent is writing and journalism the family trade? Could you tell us a bit more about what kind of stuff your dad was doing when you were a child and how that influenced you?
Of course. So my father, Tim Judah, is a sort of frontline correspondent who has written for 20 or 25 plus years, on the Balkans especially, and also reported across Africa and from Ukraine for The Economist in particular, and for the New York Review of Books. And he's like an independent journalist, so he's not on staff of anybody. He's not sort of controlled by anybody. So he's sort of master of his own times. In terms of how that influenced me, I think if my father had been a jeweler, I probably would have been a jeweler. I think if my father had been, had been a tanner, I probably would have done that. I'm creative in some ways, but very uncreative in others. And it's also like my mother has a very important influence on me. My mother has worked in publishing and worked in editing. And so that had a sort of equally important influence on me.
So having sort of become interested sort of through the family in writing, what were your kind of first steps and first publishing experiences?
It's kind of like, writing's like a big kind of word. I became interested in like a very different kind of writing from, them. Like my father's speciality is really is sort of, foreign affairs and getting to the bottom of like intricate and nitty-gritty political situations, in sort of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. And when I was growing up, I wasn't particularly interested in that and getting to the bottom of the EU summit or really getting the scoop from the NATO summit. became interested in sort of what's the sort of like another part of kind of planet journalism or planet writing, which was the part that most resembles literature, which was reportage. And I became really obsessed by what is called the Polish school of reportage, like in particular by Ryszard Kapuscinski and by Jacek Hugo Bada, who these two just brilliant kind of Polish reportage masters. Especially Kapuscinski's book called Imperium, on the fall of the Soviet Empire, which is this extraordinary mixture of like memoir, travel, history, literary exegesis, possibly fantasy.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what about the role of these are books which have faced some criticism for potentially fictionalizing aspects. Were you conscious of that when you were first encountering them, or were you bothered by that?
I wasn't particularly aware of that when I was 16, 17. But I became but the reason I like them, I wasn't particularly reading them as kind of journalism or news reportage. I was reading them just as sort of pieces of writing, and they just seemed so much more vivid and alive because they were about the real world than a lot of the kind of new and fresh novels that I was reading. And I became, they led me, were like the gateway drugs into reading reportage, on then, which was the outbreak of the Afghan War and the Iraq War, and reportage from kind of Africa, which, as far as I'm aware, is has all been super fact-checked by the publications. And I started to realise that my initial belief that I wanted to write kind of novels and short stories were where like the most real and cool writing was slightly mistaken, and actually it was in part of my father's planet of journalism. So that's how I sort of found myself there.
So I've got kind of two questions for you. The first one is, were you sort of you've talked about, finding all these inspirations from, other languages. Did you want to sort of create something of that kind that you saw in Polish writing in English? Or were you sort of more focused on just writing for its own sake?
Well, something that I've noticed in terms of my reading is that I've always, I live sort of bilingually, and I speak Eastern European languages, and I've always been a lot more excited by a lot of the kinds of journalism and reportage I found in French, or I found in Russia, or elsewhere in Eastern Europe, than I have been in English as of late.
But did that lead you?
I found the New Yorker really boring. I don't know about you.
But did that feeling lead you to want to write that way yourself in English? Did you see sort of a gap in the market, as it were?
Well, when I was at university, I made lots of kind of slightly, sort of failed attempts to write novels and to write more fiction. So yeah, it was a combination of not having managed to write something, write something fictional, and I also yeah, I wouldn't say it was like a business decision, I sort of thought of it like that. I guess I did want to write something like that in English. I guess you've explained it to me, but
that's what I'm here for. But my second question is sort of, what were your sort of first breaks into journalism?
First breaks into journalism. So as soon as I could, when I was 16, I started trying to kind of travel as much as I could for as long as possible. And my first, sort of big trip, I guess, was after I'd done my GCSEs. I went to kind of Turkey. I went to Eastern Turkey and spent the summer traveling around there, which kind of thrilled me with this sense of, the sort of unreported worlds and just how different life was in these sort of frontiers of the Middle East. And then I began very seriously learning Russian, and I went to spend, after I did my A-levels, which I sort of did out of French lycée, sort of rather complicatedly, I went to study Russian for a few months in St. Petersburg and in Moscow, and I became just completely gripped by the sort of Isherwood-like atmosphere of Moscow in the beginning of the Putin regime. And I wanted to write about that. And at the time, I didn't know if I wanted to write about it in fiction or in journalism. And my first break into journalism was when I was travelling around the Caucasus in the summer of 2008. And I happened to be there when Putin sent his forces into Georgia. And a magazine called Standpoint had been launched, and they didn't have a foreign correspondent or a roster. And I happened to be there, and I'd been writing blogs for something called ISN Security Watch, which is sort of now sadly defunct blog. And one of them was sent to them, and they got in touch. And so I wrote this Caucasus diary for them. And I tried to use some of the sort of principles behind the Polish school of reportage when I wrote that, which was that the most interesting thing about a war is not what's going on the front line where it's just sort of blasts and what your experience is going to be is cowering behind a war, but to try and report it on far away from the front lines, like in the heads of normal people. So I did this diary going through kind of Armenia and Georgia about what sort of normal people thought about the war, and they liked that. And then they asked me to write. When I got back to London, they went, "Oh, would you like to write another kind of piece of reportage for us? What would it be?" And this was my breakthrough piece, because it was the first one that got basically any attention. And I went to them that, I wanted to go in search of the Gulag and to see what it actually looked like. Like, what was actually happening there now? Like, what did these camps, look like across Siberia? Like, what was it actually like, in that landscape? And I felt like how strange it was that we had like very little sense of what those places were like, despite having a very clear idea of what Nazi death camps are like now. And so I wrote this piece called sort of In Search of the Gulag, which I travelled across Siberia through a stretch called the Road of Bones between Yakutsk and Magadan, which is Yakutsk right in the sort of middle of Siberia, and Magadan's on the coast. And I travelled along this road, this sort of ice track, which Stalin killed like between 500,000 and 1.5 million people to build. And I travelled across it through sort of hitchhiking and sort of meeting the people who lived there, who were all the descendants, mostly, of people sent to the camps, like going to try and find survivors in these isolated places.
Ben, did you have, I think I remember when we spoke on another occasion, you mentioned you had a stint in Moscow with Reuters as well. How did that fit in the mix of what you were doing?
Well, that only lasted a few months, actually, and that was sort of terminated quite rapidly because my mother became very ill, but she's not anymore, like, thank God. And so I had to sort of go back to London. So the reporting that I did about Russia afterwards was done basically for a mixture of sort of 4 or 5 month long trips, or 1 month here, 1 month there trips, whilst I was in London. So I did have a stint for Reuters in Moscow, but it wasn't very long, to be honest. And also, I must say, I was extremely unhappy.
Well, I was going to ask about this because this came up a bit when we spoke to Sam Knight, who'd had a sort of slightly oblique relationship to more conventional reporting before going off and doing his own thing. And as someone who's subsequently focused on books and longer form stuff, how did that brief encounter with the wire service piece work for you?
Well, I was just sort of basically a translator. So there was at a time, and I guess there still is, this sort of nightmarish MS-DOS system that the wire was on, and there was this sort of horrific Russian MS-DOS like wire system, and so I would be sort of plugged in on one screen to the Russian one and one screen to the Reuters one. basically a lot of what we did was just news would break on Interfax or on some of the other Russian wires, and then I would basically just write up cop killed, sort of Kabardino-Balkaria, reports Interfax. Kabardino-Balkaria is located in the Caucasus. More info soon. So I did a little bit of reporting around Moscow for them, but I was sort of the lowest grade of sort of grunt in a giant machine.
Sure. And the broader experience you had with Standpoint, what was that like? And what was the magazine kind of trying to do? And what sort of other opportunities do you have there? I read as well the piece you did about looking for the Valley of the Old Believers. But perhaps you could talk a bit more about the magazine and what its kind of mission was. I mean, how right wing was it then?
Well, I'm not too right wing. Well, the idea behind Standpoint is that, I think this is true, is that there should be a place for people to take strong opinions. There was a lot of opinion sections. I never wrote an opinion for them. And I think that their sense was that a particular Western political and literary tradition was under threat, and people were not taking seriously, this around 2008, the threat posed by jihadism, Islamism, and Putinism. And I guess I fitted pretty nicely into that sense that, things were going very much awry in Russia. But Daniel Johnson is a great believer in, big essays and the writer's voice and letting writers, express themselves. So they never edited me really. They sort of corrected a few spelling mistakes and told me that one or two paragraphs were kind of wildly, horrifically self-indulgent. But they never told me what they never told me what they what they wanted to hear. It wasn't like working for the Mail or something.
And presumably as a young writer, you got more real estate and so forth than you might have in a more
it was brilliant.
Publication.
I was so much happier that I had that relationship for 4 or 5 years with a small magazine, with a writer, with an editor that I kind of trusted and deeply admired, and with a place that would let me have every 2 months or 3 months, 4,000 words.
Did they pay you? I mean, again, we always try and ask about money as frankly as possible.
Yeah.
Did they pay you anything appreciable for those pieces?
Well, they paid me £1,000, and I got £1,000 expenses. So basically, they gave me £1,000. They would just sort it out for yourself, which I much prefer than having to deal with claiming it back, and then they're always trying to fuck you as you try and claim it back, and it's they've got these horrible bureaucracies to stop you getting the money, And so I just did it, and I found ways, kind of know how to do things cheaply, and I just found ways to do it. So that was great. And that was great. And also that allowed me to basically develop my own style and, to use that sort of pretentious word, to develop my own voice. And so I was thrilled by that. So I didn't have, that was my main, sort of experience. And also they were just, they were fun. They're one of the, I just mentioned earlier, I find, for example, the New Yorker, I find it incredibly boring. It's incredibly predictable articles and so boring, and the tone is boring, and the editing has all got the same structure. If you notice in New Yorker leads, it's always on the 15th of January, Paul Ryan was looking that way, and you flick through and it's in the 10th of May, this other guy was doing that then. And all of the articles have the same emotional tenor to them, and it's just, ugh. But Standpoint were really fun. So when I told them, I was traveling through Siberia and I found this tribe, this sort of Russian Christian sect, I guess you could say, called the Old Believers, who don't use modern technology, and they live in this incredibly remote place, not using modern technology, and they live off hunting lynx. They were like, great, can you just go there for 2 weeks and just join them and tell us what it's like?
And it seems like it was very much through the pieces that you were writing for Standpoint that you got the opportunity to write your book, Fragile Empire. Could you tell us a little bit more about that book and how that came to be?
Sure. So, I started, after I'd done a whole bunch of pieces for for Standpoint, I thought maybe this could be a book, and so I sent them off, and and then that's how Fragile Empire began. Fragile Empire kind of, I guess it's like all writers sort of like feel very ambiguous about their first books or like earlier work. Like, I didn't like. There's a lot about that book that's very intellectually insecure. I was like determined to show that a young person could write something incredible about Russia. There's like so many numbers in it. There's like so much. There's just too much. There is such a thing as like too much reporting, too much data, and too many interviews, and a book that's too long. It's like much too long.
Mm. Did you? We sort of like to kind of get into a bit of the nitty gritty of the process. But you said you had this idea that you sort of thought, okay, I really want to write this book, and you had this idea in your head. Did you take it to an agent first, or were you? What was the sort of?
I didn't have an agent at that point. I got £7,000 for it.
Mm. So you took it straight to the publisher, which is quite an academic publisher, is Yale.
Yeah, I did, and they asked me, "Can you make it slightly more academic?" Which I did. So that was how. But I kind of shopped around. Like nobody answered my emails, and that was that. So that was how it happened. But like, it was nice to work with them. They were, they gave me, they gave me like all that independence, and they took a chance on me, and I'm really appreciative of them for it.
What was the experience of working directly with an editor without kind of an agent mediating the relationship? What was that like, and did that affect your kind of experience of the writing of the book?
I don't know. I didn't have an agent, so I don't know what it would be like. Well...
Do you still not have an agent?
No, I have an agent now. I have an agent that appeared afterwards, but... Well, I don't know how it would have been different with an agent. It was just sort of, again, maybe I would have got more money, I guess, but it was nice. I liked my editor. She was really cool. We sort of, she just edited a bit, and that was that.
You talked about looking back on it now that you kind of feel that it's kind of got too much in it. How did you go about organising the material, and did you work with your editor on the kind of the structure of the book, or did you have a very clear idea of how you're going to organise the material and structure the book?
Well, basically, I just did. Basically, instead of choosing which book to do, I did two books in one. And one book is, a mixture of, essentially a history of the Putin regime, interviewing the key players, which makes the argument, which even though Putin has succeeded in conquering Russia and keeping power, he's like failed at his main mission, which is to strengthen the Russian state. And the argument, which is the Russian state inside, is actually extremely corrupt and extremely brittle, and rather than being a machine to restore the authority of the Kremlin, it's become a machine through corruption, which actually undermines the functioning of the Russian state. And then a second book, which was a kind of journey around all of these places in Russia to show that the glitz of Moscow is not Russia. And so there was just sort of too much in it. It should have really been two separate books.
And also, presumably, it was a little bit like hitting a moving target because, situations were changing all the time. How did you find a natural end point? When were you like, right, I've got to stop it at this point?
At the particular moment that I finished it, there was a sort of lull in the sort of volcano of Russian history, in which the anti-Putin protest movement had effectively subsided, and the war in Ukraine had not yet begun. So there felt like a natural moment to end it. But yeah, sort of sadly, it's a lot of it is sort of out of date.
And Ben, I have a question which is partly about your books, but a kind of more general stylistic question, really. Can you talk a bit about your interest in experimenting with different styles? For example, in some of the journalism that you sent over with the FT Uber piece, and I know the piece you did for Newsweek on Putin. Where does your interest in that come from? Who are the influences, and what avenues are you interested in pushing in that direction?
So for example, when I wrote Fragile Empire, the book was a blend of like basically two styles. One which was the kind of data-heavy think tank report and the data-heavy sort of FT, very serious, long read, plus the sort of Kapuscinski-esque travel, just footnoted and interviews recorded. And I was kind of very dissatisfied with that at the end of it, the whole experience, because there's a tradition of foreign correspondence books, which that one sort of fits into, which sort of force the writer towards, grand sweeping commentary on the state of affairs, or prognostication, or they become books about politicians, about people's reactions to politicians, which is only a very small part of a country's kind of experience. So I became quite dissatisfied with that, and I wanted to find a way to write differently. So I became, so after that, I found myself thinking about, like, how do you write that kind of book? So I decided that you can't really write those books like Bruce Chatwin or, Ryszard Kapuscinski anymore, because the way people read has changed, the way people write has changed, and that...
How so, Ben?
I love In Patagonia by Chatwin, but I don't think you can sort of really write a book like that because
it's a blend of fact and fiction, or...
Well, if he'd been a bit more serious about it could have been all fact. If you just take... I don't think that's the crux. It's just you can't write like just my travels in Argentina, because how many Brits do you think have like backpacked around Argentina? Like 2 million or something. And it's not. These lands aren't kind of foreign in that way anymore. And also, there's just so much journalism. It's so good. It's so vivid, and there's so much like Vice, and there's so much Newsnight, that I found those sort of reportage country books slightly outdated. And also there's like an impetus in, because of the way journalism is structured, you have these sort of two aristocracies of think tank, these two aristocracies of opinion writing and foreign correspondence.
Sure.
And that's just seen as what's success. It kind of leaves a whole side of journalism and a whole side of reporting basically sort of neglected. So in my thinking process, it kind of led me to think that actually the underreported and underwritten and understoried and not told in that reportage style landscapes were the ones really closest to home, and that people were very familiar with reportage writing about Africa or reportage writing about India.
Ben, can I just interrupt you there, because I think it sounds like you're moving towards your next book, which we want to talk about in just a moment.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I just had one other question. You mentioned that time moves fast in Russia, and your book, your Russia book is no longer current. But do you have clearly a momentous year for Russia-America relations, Putin, Trump, and so forth? Do you have any thoughts on the current scene and what's going on there with the Kremlin and with Trump and Russia and all of that kind of piece?
Well, it's become like, I don't really write about Russia anymore, and one of the reasons is it became basically impossible for me to do journalism there, or somebody. So you used to be able to go to Russia, get a tourist visa or some kind of dodgy business visa, and just do it. Because I've never worked, apart from briefly for Reuters, for like a news organisation. So I didn't have like the FT or the Times or whatever, like sponsoring me and getting me accreditation and a press card with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I was doing it, in the grey zone, like, possibly if you look at the Russian criminal code, illegally. Mm-hmm. And over the last few years, they would now just arrest you and expel you for basically breaking visa regulations. It was unenforced, and there was kind of understanding that that's how it was done. So that became very difficult. And secondly, they just clamped down. So you can't interview. You can't get to the bottom of all these different organisations. There are people that you can interview, and people are accessible that they've made accessible, and everybody else doesn't talk to journalists. And so I found in my reporting, I was sort of going around in circles. I could interview the opposition, and the Russian opposition were fascinating, but I sort of found I'd run out of what I could sort of write about them or add about them after I've been reporting on them for like 3 or 4 years. And it's, I must say, it is sort of the same characters. Like after a while, I just started to wish there would be like another president in Russia, or just some other figures that I could write about. But there aren't. So it's like 2 reasons. I sort of, I kind of sort of ran out of things I could report, really. And then like the things that you can report in Russia, which are the kind of reportage pieces from Siberia or the Caucasus, I felt I'd sort of done all the ones I wanted to do, and it also began to feel that it wasn't actually very original, and that it was basically sort of mimicking my heroes and sort of mimicking a sort of pretty, an established 1970s tradition.
We're going to move on to This Is London, but just one more just question as a point of interest. How long did it take from taking the idea to the publisher to publication itself? How long did Fragile Empire take?
3 years, I think.
3 years. And so moving on to your second book, did you get sort of an agent and sort of do things a lot more officially off the back of Fragile Empire?
Well, so basically after I finished Fragile Empire, all of this, there was a lot of like mental dissatisfaction going around in me about, what's original, how to do something different, how to not do what everybody else is doing. And I started doing pieces for Standpoint, just sort of experimenting with, what I could do and what could potentially be books. So I went to Ukraine and I did a reportage piece there, which I tried to do it differently, and I wrote it about the nightmares that people were having in Kiev, and about the psychologists of Kiev and what was going through people's heads and people's fears then, sort of the anti-front line. And then it didn't really work, and then I went on a sort of Hasidic pilgrimage to try and write about like the insides of sort of Jewish religious experience. And again, I sort of left feeling sort of been here before and sort of done that before, and then I went back to Standpoint and I went, I think I had a totally daft idea, which was I'd heard that there were groups of people killing poachers in the Amazon, and I was sort of curious, I could have like joined one of those groups, was curious to see what would happen. And they went, I'm sorry, Ben, we don't have any more money for that extra £1,000 we used to give you to do, to go abroad. Or, can't you do anything in London? So I was like, and I needed the work. So I went, well, can't I just be a foreign correspondent in London and write about Eastern European London? And it's out of this essay I did for them on working as a Polish builder that my next book, This Is London, sort of emerged.
Did you immediately know after you'd written that essay that you felt that this could be a book?
And I immediately knew a lot of things, actually. First thing I realised, this is original. It's taking a register of writing, a way of writing, which is used to, developed to describe, far off countries, and applying it to what's ignored under people's noses. And I felt, this is original at last. And then I felt, there was just like a music to it, and I wanted to write more, and I could just instantly see that I wanted to write a book about London, but London seen from the point of view of normal people from the different immigration waves that had reshaped the British capital since I was born, and turned London into a very different city than the one I'd been at school at before I started reporting on Russia, when my mind was sort of mentally elsewhere.
And could you talk a bit about the process of doing it? I mean, how you went around spending time with these different groups, the Polish builders and so forth, and how you got into them, and just what your kind of reporting method and the timescale for doing that was?
Sure. Well, it was basically 2.5 years, and I was just mentally trying to remind myself what the whole timescale were. So I'm writing something else now, and basically, for the first 8 months, it was a disaster. I was just interviewing people and they were boring, or I was interviewing people I didn't know what I was asking them, and I was interviewing all these sort of annoying NGO type people, and I was just getting nothing out of it, and I was thinking, oh God, I can't write, I don't want to write a book which has the word Sadiq Khan in it, or Zach Goldsmith. It's just not what I want to do. And then kind of slowly as I was like looking at my notes, I was thinking, what is different between all these experiences? And I suddenly realised, oh, hold on, the arc here is the arc of life and death. And the immigration is an experience a bit like birth, it's an arrival. A whole bunch of my interviewees are describing that first phase, which is arrival and excitement, and essentially the memories of young people in the city. Then a whole second stack of my interviewees are describing what it was like to, raise children, and to raise children that are very different from you in London. And then what it's like to get old, what it's like to fail, what it's like to succeed, what it's like to be transformed by London, and then what it's like to die. So once I'd worked that out, that I wanted to write a book about the arc of life and death in the new London, it all became very simple, like what I was looking for. I was looking for people whose lives and whose stories could read like small novels, who would tell me, what all these different experiences of the life cycle is like in 21st century London. And then that became easy. In terms of like how to show people.
How did you go about, actually getting into these groups, gaining access, gaining their trust, getting them to hang around with you? Did language play a big part in that, or?
It's basically just language. And so, for Eastern European groups, I speak Russian, and I actually speak quite decent Romanian. And in order, for example, to sort of live with Roma on the street, I found friends from the Romanian community who could help me and guide me into it, to try and kind of get to know them, and then I was able to convince them, because I had a common language with them, to sort of let me join them. And also just time. I've had 2 years to do it, and there are only like 15 chapters in it. So the amount of, in terms of like there aren't that many portraits in it. So, for example, in terms of like living in the Doss house with them, I wanted to. There were places I couldn't get access to just by asking people if I could interview them, and I wanted to show how, one of these experiences of arriving in London from Eastern Europe was living in these overstuffed Doss houses of like 20 more people. In like one single room, sometimes much, much more. And so I basically kind of Googled on these sort of migrant notice boards and on the migrant Facebook groups, got the numbers of people who were running them, and then went just saying that I was a migrant worker from Ukraine with a friend who was Romanian, and that's how we got in.
And did you write a lot of it on your phone? I think I read an interview or something like that your actual writing method was to use your phone. Is that right?
Yeah, I wrote vast chunks of it actually on my phone, because I find often the best writing and the clearest thoughts and the best descriptions, judge for yourself, I don't think they're good descriptions, are the ones that come to me really in the moment, when I can kind of hear that voice in my head, and I just wrote them down instantly. Also, like, often I was in situations where, I couldn't really take out my computer, or I couldn't really take out Notepad. So, like for example, when I was in that DOS house, it was, I was there for days. It was, I was taking notes on my phone. Not to give the game away.
What were do you have any ethical concerns about sort of misleading the people that you were interviewing or saying that you were sort of someone who you weren't?
No.
And this book seems like it was a very different one. Firstly, it seems like it was a lot more intentional, and secondly, it was a lot more official. Did you have your agent by this stage, and what was the process like of getting the advance? What had you learned from your first experience of writing a book?
Well, the experience of the first book was that the publisher was looking for a book on Russia, and I was the right guy at the right time for them. And they told me what they wanted, and then I sort of did it in my own way. Whereas with this book, it was a book I wanted to write, and it was exactly what I wanted to write, and I knew exactly what I wanted to write, and I felt I knew how to write it. And then I went to various publishers. So I got an agent, I told her what I wanted to do, she liked the idea, and then a lot of publishers were interested, and then that's sort of how it happened.
Was there sort of, with the advance, was there a bidding war, and did you have concerns about, getting, did you get a sort of very large advance after a bidding war, or was there anything sort of in the process that surprised you doing it this way round?
So there were, so there was an auction, as they say, which I find very funny, as if there's like an auction house for books. And, people made offers, and I went with Picador Macmillans. They offered me a contract to do 3 different books. So I've got a contract to do 2 more, actually.
What was your feeling about that multi-book contract? I mean, clearly, there are different factors. You know what you're doing for a longer period of time, but then you're sort of tied in at certain levels and so forth. How both at the time and subsequently, how have you felt about a multi-book deal?
Well, I felt very happy because, I wanted to be a writer, and somebody was offering me a platform to sort of to do it. And also, I had no idea whether the book was going to be any good or whether it would get any attention. And I sort of felt, oh, great, well, if it's a complete flop, I've got 2 more tries, really.
But I suppose, but then it was a big success, right? It was a big seller as well, and so forth. Did that then mean that you felt you were obliged to do your next work for less money, frankly, than you would have got if you'd been able to kind of go to the open market on the back of the success of This Is London?
This is why it is useful to have an agent.
Yeah.
I think like somewhere in the appendix B.C. of the contract, it was written, and I would advise anybody doing a multi-book deal to do this. It goes, if X number of, if like 10,000 books are sold, the second book shall be remunerated at this level. If 50,000 books are sold, it shall be remunerated at this level. And if 1 million books are sold, it shall be remunerated at that level. And that basically takes the sting out of, signing a book when you're signing a contract to do 3 different books when you're an unknown writer at a very low rate, and they're getting trapped in that. But it also creates a situation for the publisher where if your books just are not a hit, they don't get screwed financially either. So that happened there. So I could probably have got more money, maybe significantly more money if I'd done it, if I just started afresh again. But the particular clauses of that contract meant that I was fine. I wasn't fucked.
Mm. And on the upside, you don't have to worry about earning out in advance or the book having been a failure. I guess it takes the pressure off in that way as well. But it seems like This Is London.
That was very important for me to do that because, it was pretty unstable what I was doing at the time.
Yeah.
Like I was only doing these sort of standpoint pieces, and I was doing stuff for a think tank, which was kind of like, it's not great literature, is it? And like Standpoint has sort of sadly, doesn't really have very much money anymore, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to do that forever. And I'd approached a lot of the big newspapers, and they were all like, "Come on," and
approached them to do what, Ben?
After I read the Russia book, I went like, "Oh, have you got any jobs?" And the answer was no, or not for you.
But it seems like, This Is London was a real success, and it led you to not only, writing more books as part of your deal, but also doing work for TV. Can you talk us a little bit through that and the pieces that you have done for Newsnight and others?
Well, so Newsnight. So I made this film for Newsnight with some of the people from the book. I asked them, do you mind? And they were like, no, we were very happy. And so some of the people from the book featured on a Newsnight package. How did that happen? Well, basically, the publisher employed a PR firm which got in touch with Newsnight, and Newsnight were like, sure, well, he can make that little video. So I didn't contact Newsnight. That's just how that happened.
Did you enjoy the process for it, and did you write the script, and did you find the process of making...
I wrote the script, and by that point I'd been experimenting with a different sort of writing style. So when I was writing This Is London, I was experimenting. So This is London's like written in a lot of... It's very experimental, actually. I decided there's no point doing this unless you take risks. There's no point being kind of conservative about your writing style, especially when you're young. Like, this is the time that you should make mistakes, and so like a lot of it's written in... It alternates between bits that are actually written in prose poetry and bits which are written in kind of direct reporting style, or bits that kind of morph into these people's ways of looking at the world. And it's when I came out of that, there's like lots of the chapters are written like quite differently in ways I thought best reflected these people and their experiences. Some, in which I was maybe more inspired by like Mayhew. Some where I was maybe more inspired by like longer sentences like Amos. Some where I was, more inspired by doing it like, Jack London. And by the time I came out of that, I sort of had realised that a very, very sparse, lapidary style was best, like very, almost very skeletal. And I wrote this script for Newsnight, which I was very proud of, actually, which I felt sort of captured the emotions of these people. And then after that, I've done a lot more experiments with that style. So I wrote a few covers for the FT Life and Arts in that style.
A question on sort of style and on sourcing, kind of following that. I know there was a kind of minor fracas a few years ago when I think you wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about the Shard, and then there was some suggestion online that some of the factual details weren't nailed down or things like that. How do you combine these stylistic innovations with sort of reporting rigor?
That fracas was just horrible. So there was a. So basically, I wrote. What did I write? I wrote that. The top of the Shard were the top of the Shard are apartments for oligarchs, where they can, sort of look down at a London beneath them and be insulated off them. And then the PR people behind the Shard started pumping out all of this stuff against me, going, "Oh yeah, this Judah, like." We haven't even sold them. Which wasn't public at the time. So, and they were going, and so that sort of turned into this sort of weird, like, nasty furore in which I was like identified as an American, and like columns were written about me in the FT and in the Times, and like
and Ben,
the Evening Standard saying that I should go back to America.
Sort of moving on from that, or connected
I don't
really.
Want to move on from that, actually. In which I actually thought that was like basically sort of slightly anti-Semitic. There was one column going, "Oh, you should go back to Brooklyn, this Judah," And I thought, fuck off. It's just like, if I was called Powell, no one would have said. No one would have just assumed that.
Well, and the broader question I wanted to ask was about the internet and social media and so forth. You're someone who's kind of embraced that, but also we were just looking. It seems that you've left Twitter for the time being. What has been over your career, your kind of interaction with social media, and where do you see that mixing with a writer's life?
Well, it's kind of like in 2014, 2015. It was quite, I don't know, I had a good time. It was quite a lot of fun. Like, I'm kind of on my own. Like, I don't have colleagues. Like, I don't, I'm just sort of doing my own thing. So it allowed me basically to sort of, I guess, get to know a lot of other journalists and sort of see what they were like. So I enjoyed that, actually. And then I became very addicted to, like, the sort of gamification of it. Like, I wanted my retweets and I wanted my, like, stars and stuff. And it gave me at the time like a real rush, but then Twitter tonight is basically being destroyed by like bots, witch hunts, and all the people I was sort of interested in it have just gone silent, and people don't use it in the same way anymore. And then I found that I was just asking myself like a few months ago, I was like, is Trump's favourite medium? Is it really my favourite medium? And I started to see how everybody's tweets were kind of a little bit like Trump's tweets, including my own. Like attention grabbing, promoting, just kind of like dumb, outrage machines. And I thought,
and you've also left London physically as well, right?
Yeah, I'm not in London, I'm in Paris.
And can you talk a little bit about what you're working on now and the work that you're kind of, your future work?
So what I've done actually over the last years, I did these covers for the Sunday Times magazine, and I did a sort of profile interview with the French President Emmanuel Macron, and I did that kind of in terms of reporting style. Well, these are very different. These are sort of, I don't know, I wanted to do like kind of, that kind of American style, like, speak to everybody. I wanted to do like what I hadn't been doing in This Is London. I wanted to do like powerful people at the centre of things, all of getting all these like important people on the record to say things about them. So I did this profile of Macron, which was really interesting, and it was interesting to meet him as well. And I did one that's actually coming out tomorrow on Imran Khan in Pakistan. So I've done that. Did that for like a year. And
were you contracted to write them? Were you doing them freelance, or how did that work?
I just did freelance.
Mm. And presumably you're also working on the second book for Picador.
Well, it's taken a long time to work out what I want to do, to be honest, for that. And so I've been thinking a lot again about like, what is original, and like what kind of writing style do I want to do, and what do I want to write about, and like what is the value added. And I went to school in French, and by the end of that schooling experience I was really fed up of the French language and the French language debate, and I wanted to be, I can write in French, but I didn't want to be a French writer. I didn't want to go to university in France. It felt the country had been run by Jacques Chirac, and before him by like another festering old man, and it didn't feel very exciting. The debate didn't feel very exciting. And over the last year, I have become extremely bored of the intellectual debate in the US and in the UK. And I found there was a very exciting moment in the debate after the referendum and after Trump's election, when there was a hint that we were going to have a very serious debate about ethnic change and social class, and that's sort of gone. And like in Britain, we're just talking about the process of Brexit, and even the Brexit ideology itself, or the Corbyn ideology itself, it's very empty, it's very vacuous. And in the US, it's just become this hysterical, Twitterized debate in which there's one topic for 3 days and then it's completely forgotten about. And I became very uninterested in the books that are coming out of it. You take the Michael Wolff book as an example. There's just very little in it. There's a lot of sensation around it. And spending a lot of time in France and slipping back into French, I noticed the debate here is so much more interesting and so much more to the point and just so much richer.
So do you know what you're going to write, Ben?
Well, I'm still doing the first stage of reporting about that. So I want to report for 4 months, 5 months, and see what sort of comes out of it.
Well, we look forward to seeing the result.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, but it's just it's just the experience of going in. It's just the experience of spending time in the French media and just going into a French bookshop. It's just just the world of ideas and the aliveness of ideas you get here is really satisfying. And there's a lot of writers whose work I really admire here, and I think is a lot of novels that are coming out of here which I think are really interesting. I'm very bored of the state of the novel in English, and especially in the US, people keep on parroting things like identity politics, and they refuse to get to the point and refuse to kind of break it down. And a lot of the political debate in the US and therefore in English has become sort of like sports. Every channel is based on ESPN in terms of the music, in terms of who's up, who's down, who's winning, who's losing, and just very shallow.
Well, listen, Ben, we should wrap this up. But this has been a really fascinating conversation, and we wish you all the very best of luck with your projects going forward. Hello, it's us again with an update from our lives. Cassia, what have you been up to?
I have handed in the first draft of my book, and
Amazing.
I'm free until the edit comes back, in which case I'll be back at my desk. But for the moment, I'm, sort of swanning around, having
footloose
and fancy free, and it's bliss. How about you?
I'm slogging away on my book, but still.
Forget about you. Let's talk more about me.
Yeah, it's still going okay. I've just finished a piece for the Paris Review, which is cool. It's going alright. It's still hard work, but end in sight, I think. Jolly. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted as ever by me, Simon Aiken.
And me, Cassia Sinclair.
Our producers are Olivia Cralin, Ed Kiernan, and Liz Davies.
Our social media is by Zara Hankier. Our music is by Jess Danheiser, and James Edgar is responsible for our graphic design.
And we are on all manner of social media platforms. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. Our website is alwaystakenotes.com.
And as ever, please do leave us a review on iTunes. It really helps. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.